Try. I try.
Hi, everyone. Good evening and welcome to our presentation of The Kissing Bug with author Daisy Hernandez and our moderator, Alex Espinoza. This event includes an audience Q&A. To submit your question, please use the Ask a Question feature at the very bottom of the screen. You can also vote for any questions you like and they'll make their way to the very top of the list. Also, we have signed book plates available for those interested. Just click on the green purchase button directly below the viewer's screen. And when you're checking out your cart, please make sure to write signed book plate in the order comments so that we have a signed book plate reserved for you. All right, with that said, let me introduce our guests and then we can get started. So Daisy Hernandez is a former reporter for the New York Times and has been writing about the intersections of race, immigration, class, and sexuality for almost 2 decades. She edited Colonize This, Young Women of Color on Today's Feminism and Color Lines, a news magazine on race and politics, and she has also written for National Geographic, NPR's All Things Considered, Code Switch, Slate, and more. And joining her tonight is Alex Espinoza, the author of the novel Stillwater Saints and the 5 Acts of Diego Leon. He serves on the California Humanities, a statewide nonprofit whose aim is to connect Californians to ideas and one another in order to understand our shared heritage and diverse cultures. So with that said, I'm going to turn my camera off and enjoy the talk, everyone.
Thank you so much, Rira. Daisy, how's it going?
It is fabulous. I'm so excited to be here with you. I wish I was in person so I could give you a hug, but this is fantastic too.
It's great to be here with you, and you know, as a friend and as a fan for many years, it's just wonderful to be able to share the space with you and to welcome you to Vroman's, one of my favorite bookstores in Southern California, and to say congratulations on the new book, The Kissing Bug, which I've been enjoying and reading, and I have some questions, and I hope we get into a very robust conversation because there's a lot of really interesting stuff to talk about with this book. First off, I have to tell you that I am deathly afraid of bugs. So let's just get that off the table right now. Like, let's just make that abundantly clear. Bugs frighten me to no end. And so I commend you for writing a book about a bug, because you spent so much time having to research that. So my first question,
completely understand your fears.
And you explained that in the book. So I wanted to sort of just open with a really broad question. How did the idea for this book begin?
Yeah, that's a fantastic question. And I do share your fear of insects very deeply. So the fact that I'm here sitting with you and talking about a book that's named The Kissing Bug is just nothing that I would have ever imagined. But the book began, you know, in some ways, sometimes I think this book began when I was 6 years old. That's when my auntie was diagnosed with this parasitic disease that's transmitted by an insect, a triatomine insect that in English we nicknamed the kissing bug. And at 6 years old, I was interpreting for her between Spanish and English with nurses and doctors back in New Jersey, where I was born and where I grew up. And so sometimes I think, gosh, in some ways this story really begins there, where I was already talking about a disease that I didn't understand, that I only knew its name. Its actual name is Chagas disease, but I knew so little about it. I grew up with it. You know, my auntie was diagnosed with it in the chronic form. There isn't a cure for this disease, and 1 in 3 people can go on to develop really serious health issues as a result of it and can even die from it, which is what happened to my auntie many years after her initial diagnosis. And in the wake of her death, I was actually writing a short story about a young girl and her mother, and it was centered around the mother being diagnosed with this disease. And it was actually in writing fiction that it really hit me that I knew so little about this disease that had, just devastated our family. My auntie and I had a really complicated kind of mother-daughter relationship over the years. I never almost expected her to die from this disease. I just knew that I knew of it as a chronic illness that kind of kept her in and out of hospitals, but I just never expected her to actually die from this. And so it just shocked me how little I knew. And that's when I began researching and found out that there's actually 300,000 people in the United States who have this disease. And they're all like my auntie. They're immigrants from South or Central America or Mexico. And that number just shocked me because my auntie was the only person I knew who had this disease, and we were pretty isolated around it. So I wanted to find out who are these other families and what are their experiences like. But I also realized I needed to know more about the disease, and I needed to know more about how it's transmitted. And so in those early days, actually, when I was reading science articles about these insects, I would hold the mouse and like kind of, because a lot of these science articles come with drawings or photographs of the insects. So I would actually click and move it so that the photos were off screen, but I could still read the text. And I would manipulate it on the screen so I could just not look at the insects the entire time. Yeah. And oh my goodness, it took so long for me to walk through that initial fear. And it took many times probably actually, where now it's like really easy for me to, I wouldn't say to be around them, that would be an exaggeration, but I can definitely really easily look at the photographs and ended up actually really being fascinated by the insect itself. And of course by the parasite, which is quite ancient in and of itself. Yeah.
So that must have been interesting then, what you just said, because there's so much about the sort of the scientific aspect of it, right? But what you manage to do so elegantly and poignantly in the book is you put that personal face to it, right? Especially with your tia, and you see step by step all of the difficult things that physically what it does to her. And it's this tiny little bug that actually, color wise, and even there's a section where you actually mention like it's actually kind of beautiful, right? Where there's like the colors on it. So it's really interesting that you take a look at this insect that is kind of like pretty looking in a strange way, but causes so much devastation, right? I thought that was a really interesting thread that you managed to pull. And also this idea of the fact that even though you were translating for her, there was so much about her situation that you just didn't know, right? As a child. And you state in the book, migration and poverty swallowed parts of the story, made it so that stories were half told, almost perdidos. As one of your tias, Auntie Biblia, recounted how Tia Dora got the kissing bug disease. Was this book then, in a way, an opportunity for you to tell the whole story?
Absolutely. And I'm glad you pointed to that section, because the story that I actually received when I was 13 years old is what my family told me, which is that this idea that my auntie had eaten an apple in Colombia, and that's why she's almost dying and is so sick here in New Jersey. And so I, as I got older, obviously I realized that can't be the whole story. Something, as you read, something got lost here. And my family, in Colombia was a very modest means. My auntie was the first girl in her family, the only girl in her family to go to college. And that was by working during the day and going to classes in the afternoon and the evenings. And so there was a lot of information that we just did not have access to and that I didn't have growing up. And so absolutely part of writing the story was, going back and, as so many of us Latinx writers do in the US, like documenting the parts that have been lost or have not been named, getting information, that wasn't available to us before. And, one of the points that's like very bittersweet for me is that I so wish that my auntie had lived for me to tell her so much of what I ended up learning in terms of the medicine and the science and also the history of the disease as well. Because I think that even apart from her own illness, she would have been so fascinated because she loved learning and she loved education. So It's such a story that I wish I could have written while she was alive. But I still feel like, yeah, that was absolutely one of the motivators, was documenting what got lost with poverty and migration.
Yeah, because I mean, so much of our experiences do get misfiled in a lot of ways, right?
Yes.
So much gets sort of miscommunicated, and especially when you're a child and you're acting as interpreter, because a lot of times you're saying and having to use a vocabulary and words that you don't fully understand, right? But there you are in a position to have to sort of, mitigate things. It's a incredibly complicated, and though you know and speak both languages, oftentimes that doesn't mean that you're getting the full story, right? And that you're getting this sort of full
Absolutely.
information.
Yeah, absolutely. I remember being 6 years old and feeling the weight of how much was expected of me, but it's so normalized because you don't know anything else. And it was only as an adult looking back going, oh, wow, I was translating in a medical context at, before first grade, basically. So only later does it really hit you sort of the enormity of what, so many children in immigrant families do. And just amazing, our resiliency. And yeah, when I didn't know a word in Spanish, I just made the English word sound like Spanish, put a little bit more vowels in it, and yeah.
Well, I think also one of the things that's really fascinating about your book is the deep dive that you take in terms of not just with your family history and your Tia Dora's almost very sort of epic life, right? The way you sort of paint her as this very unique individual who was stricken by this this unfortunate parasite. But you also look at the intricacies of the origin of the disease Chagas. Now, I first heard about the kissing bug and the disease Chagas when I was an undergraduate at UC Riverside, and I took an entomology class. And that was when I first was introduced to, because UC Riverside has one of the biggest like entomology programs in the country. It's really well known. And so I took an entomology class and I was freaked out. And that's when I first learned about Chagas and the kissing bug. So when I saw your book, I was like, aha, I know what this book's about. But I didn't know half of what you explore in the book. One of the things that I was under the misconception about was, and that your book helped correct for me, was that this isn't a disease and a parasite that just exists in certain parts of the country, right? Like, and I remember my professor talking about it specifically, and saying these bugs exist in South America, they exist in these parts of the world, and thinking like, oh, well, in the U.S. we don't have that problem, right? But in reality, you explore the presence of Chagas and the kissing bug in other countries, especially places like here in the U.S., right? Could you talk about how the book explores the profound ramifications that Chagas has had in places like Texas and especially here in California?
Yeah, and I love that you took an entomology course, even with your fear of insects.
Even with my fear. You know what? I need
Talk
to
about embracing your fear. That's wonderful. Yeah, so actually the United States is actually the only place outside of Latin America that has these kissing bugs, or these triatomine insects. And they've been identified at this point in 30 states in the United States. Some of those, it's only been 1 or 2 sightings, so very rare. They're mostly going to be in the South, in Texas, in the Southwest, and all over California, including Northern California as well. And that's partly because kissing bugs are very picky about the temperature that they live at, right? Like they like it in that sort of like warm 60 degrees, 70, but not too hot, not too hot, not too cold, a little bit of Goldilocks in that sense, needs to be sort of like in a good range for them. And yes, they have actually been known in the United States for quite a long time. So I was really surprised to find out that as far back as, the 1940s, researchers knew about these insects in the United States and were were wondering if the parasite could be transmitted from insects native to the United States, because even though we're saying kissing bugs, there's actually more than 100 species just in South America. It's 5 of those more than 100 that are considered to be dangerous in terms of their ability to transmit the parasite. But there are many, and there's species that are very specific to the United States. Texas is interesting because it has, I think, 11 different species now of the insect. So it has quite a variety that we don't see in other places. But California definitely has a really interesting history around the kissing bug, because yes, people in Griffith Park there in Southern California were finding kissing bugs. I actually went there and was like looking around myself to see what I might find. So they have definitely been known to be all over California. And what's interesting in the United States is that we don't have to worry in the same way as people in South America and Central America and Mexico, who often are coming into contact with the insects in rural areas where their homes are located. And these are housing structures that are usually what they consider to be very porous, just meaning that it's easy for these insects to enter the home in some way. And they actually come out at night only, and they feed on the victims at night, oftentimes while people are sleeping, which is part of how they make it through and survive. And so in the US, in general, we tend to have housing that is able to keep those insects out. But I always recommend for people who are concerned, are curious, to look at the Kissing Bug Guide created by wonderful researchers at Texas A&M University in College Station. And it's really easy to find online, but it'll also give people pictures of what you're actually looking for, because sometimes you can kind of, misidentify a kissing bug. But yes, and California is also really stands out to me in terms, this is more of the journalism side of the work that I did, because when I looked at the case numbers in terms of where we have the highest number of people infected, in terms of those 300,000 Latinx immigrants, by and far away, many of them are in California. Like 71,000 people are in California who have this disease. It's also the only, we only have had one clinic devoted to this disease in the whole country. And it was started there in Los Angeles County, actually, by an amazing cardiologist, Dr. Shiba Maimandi, who saw that there was an incredible need because she was seeing patients in her cardiac clinic who were suffering from this disease. So California has a special place, I think, when we talk about Chagas disease in the US, and in my opinion needs a lot more attention and a lot more funding and more public education than it has received from the CDC and even from state officials.
Wow. Well, Daisy, I'm wondering if you could read us a section of the kissing bug.
Yes, actually, because we are talking about California, I am going to read from this chapter about a woman whose experiences I documented there, and for me, as I said before, it was so important to go and to find other people who were facing this illness, like my auntie. I really wanted to know what their stories were, because I wanted to make sure that they were documented, for others that are facing this, and for the rest of us to know what people are going through. So this is from a chapter called Maida. When a cardiologist in Los Angeles put me in touch with one of her patients, she did not mention Wonder Woman, but I thought of the superhero the morning that I showed up at Maida's house in Southern California. Her straight black hair pulled around her shoulders, and on the inside of her right wrist, she bore a tattoo of swirls, the symbol for the Akan people in Ghana, meaning, except for God, I fear none. Maida did strike me as fearless. At 6, I was good with a slingshot, she said, matter of fact, remembering her childhood in Central America. Back then, when her grandmother's boyfriend grew violent, Maida did not think twice about being a little girl in a handmade dress without shoes. She grabbed a broom and started beating the man on the head. Now in her 40s, Maida had a well-stocked kitchen in the San Fernando Valley, and the morning that I arrived, she was sporting a pink summer dress with a matching blazer and cream-colored sandals with straps curled around her ankles. She kept her husband and 2 teenage children on task with house chores. The kitchen counters sparkled. She had worked at Universal Studios since she was 16. Her first job was with the cleaning staff, and more than 20 years later, she was an executive assistant to several directors at the theme park. Soon, she would be working in the president's office. Every morning, she made sure the directors had their daily schedules printed, and she fielded calls, arranged travel itineraries, and generated reports. She saw these executives as extensions of her own kingdom, or as she told one of them, "When you look bad, I look bad." Maida was straightforward and unapologetic. The first time we spoke by phone about her having the kissing bug disease, she said, you get to the point where you're like, if they tell you to drink pee, you'll do it. She had been diagnosed in Los Angeles County in the late 90s, and for years she was asymptomatic. Her doctor procured the drug nifurtimox for her. Maida had hoped that this drug would reduce the parasite load in her body because there is no cure for Chagas in the chronic stage. In 2015, however, her cardiologist looked at an MRI of Maida's chest and saw that the parasite was beginning to eat away at the wall of her heart. That was why I was here in her spotless kitchen, sipping a cup of her coffee. Maida had agreed to let me tag along for her annual EKG and echocardiogram. We would see if the parasite had damaged her heart any more in the last year. Maida did have one advantage over the parasite. Her cardiologist, Shiva Maimandi, had started the first clinic in the United States devoted to the kissing bug disease, and she had become an internationally recognized expert on the disease in the United States. Now, granted, the clinic, which opened in 2007, was essentially a one-woman operation in a county hospital in the San Fernando Valley, but it was better than most patients with the disease had in this country. It was better than what my tia Dora had experienced. California has the highest number of people with the kissing bug disease in the United States, close to 71,000 people, all of whom are Latin American immigrants. So Maida was one of thousands in the state who had the disease, but she was one of the few who knew it. And, I'll stop there. I really want to underscore too that this parasite is astounding in what it can do to the human body. So once it's transmitted by this kissing bug, it can actually lie dormant in the body for 10, 20, even 30 years before it starts to cause any kind of symptoms for the person. And most people live with the parasite their entire lives and actually have no health complications. So it's about 1 in 3 who end up having some kind of cardiac issue, and a smaller number of those who can die from those heart issues. But so the issue also becomes that if you're not experiencing symptoms and there isn't a lot of public education about this disease, you can be someone who's infected and doesn't even know it. Maida was simply completely lucky that she donated blood during this time when the Red Cross was actually trying to figure out, if it needed to screen donors for Chagas disease, and luckily it decided that yes, they do need to screen donors for this disease. But she was just completely lucky that happened. So there's still so much that needs to be done in terms of public health education so that people even know about this disease, because so many people are infected and don't know it.
And also so many people are infected. I think one of the things that was really touching and poignant also in your book is so many people are infected, and there's also the shame and the stigma associated with admitting that you're infected by this, right? You mentioned that your tia was afraid usually that you and your family didn't tell people because of the stigma that was don't hang out with them, right? Don't associate with them because they have this disease. And then in that section, one of the things that I thought was really powerful was when you go with Maida to her appointment, and there's this whole like wing dedicated to this, and then the nurses are like vocal, right? They say like, oh, the Chagas unit, and you as a person who grew up sort of feeling like you have to keep this a secret, suddenly it's present, right? It's there and people are talking about it.
That was something that I was, that was something that I was so fascinated about, because we grew up with, my auntie didn't want anyone to know that she had Chagas disease, and she felt very heavily that weight of stigma. And I often think that it was in part because she got here in 1980, and the 80s, as you know, was the advent of the AIDS epidemic. And so even though we didn't have anyone in our family who contracted HIV, it was still so known that there was so much stigma, and that people were really suffering, being excluded, losing jobs, not being able to get housing. I mean, it was just very known. And I think younger generations don't know quite how devastating that decade in particular was. And I have often wondered if that was part of the reason that she felt such fear around it. And it was one of the questions that I really had for patients. And what I ended up finding out was, yes, like in this case in Los Angeles County, there's a clinic here. It's so normalized. It is not a big deal. It's like, okay, you have Chagas, you have diabetes, whatever it might be.
Yeah.
And I also found out that in certain parts of South America, where you have communities that have long, for many decades, have struggled with high rates of Chagas disease, it's also very normalized. It's almost a little too normalized, where people say, oh yeah, he died from Chagas, or yeah, he has Chagas, or she has Chagas. It's sort of like not taken very, I don't want to say not taken seriously, but it's treated as a very common ailment, and it's accepted that, we don't have access to healthcare, and that you're going to die from this at a very young age, actually. And that was all really different than how we talked about the disease at home. And then the flip side, as you might know from the book, is going to Texas and meeting this woman who was infected by a kissing bug native to Texas, and a white woman, who had been born and raised and not really been much outside of Texas. And she felt the stigma, not from her peers necessarily, but from a doctor who said, who told her basically, if I were you, I wouldn't tell anyone that I had this, and so kind of reinforcing this idea of being silent. And the beautiful part of that story is that that woman, she did keep silent for about a year, and then she decided, no, actually, this is crazy. Like, we have these insects all over our area, the community that she lives in. And she started talking about it, even went and testified in DC in front of the FDA. I mean, really became a spokesperson for people with this illness.
Wow. And yeah, that's why it's important, I think, to have a documentation like your book that sort of sheds light on these experiences, because who knows how many people have it, and also the danger that we don't know because of our own ignorance, right? And not just our own ignorance, but the fact that our governments sometimes don't invest in the public health areas that are needed in order to relay the information about how important it is to avoid these bugs, right? Or to research them and figure out, what this parasite can do and how to avoid it. You mentioned historian Alan M. Krautz and his use of the term medicalized nativism, which in short is the blame that's placed on immigrants for being carriers of a disease, right? And we've seen that rhetoric happen throughout history with illnesses like tuberculosis, cholera, and more recently COVID-19 being tied to immigrant communities, the Asian American community, the Latino community, Latinx community, people crossing the border, there's whole rhetoric about like they're bringing COVID-19. I wonder how Chagas complicates this false argument. Like, can you shed some light on how the kissing bug and Chagas and the way it operates maybe complicates that argument, so that we can't place blame squarely on a segment of the population or a group of individuals, that it's a really false argument? How does Chagas complicate that, if at all?
Yeah, actually, one of the ways that it complicates it is by the fact that we're the only country outside of Latin America who also has these kissing bugs that are carrying this parasite, and that has infected people here in the United States. So this idea that, you know, disease happens in other places, that it happens beyond our borders, you know, turns out to be completely false. You know, we might not have the rates that there are in South America and Central America, for example. But we still have the insects, and we still have the parasite, and we still have the disease being native to here. And I really struggled as I was working on the book with calling them, you know, native insects. You know, I ended up referring to it as like homegrown Chagas disease, for lack of a better term. But I think that's one of the ways that it complicates it. And then I think the other aspect is that, you know, we have to complicate the discussion too, right? So the reality is that this parasite was found in a mummy in South Texas, a mummy that is 1,000 years old. Wow. So, you know, there was one writer who's a parasitologist who wrote that, you know, Chagas disease is like an incredibly American disease, you know, that it's of the Americas, it's of the Western Hemisphere. It's actually much more prevalent, you know, the disease burden, rather, not the prevalence, but the disease burden is much higher than malaria for the Western Hemisphere. But this idea, I really found it actually, for me, it was really interesting to complicate these ideas about border and citizenship and disease by going into the history, actually. And so finding that there was this mummy, it turned out it was a young man who, very similar to my auntie, where the parasite went after his gastrointestinal system. And so they found parasitic DNA evidence of the parasite still from those remains. But he basically ended up with like a swollen belly. So he probably looked like he was pregnant, like a man with kind of a pregnancy. And what was so touching to me, and I think this is also part of complicating these ideas around disease and outsiders, is that he was buried with woven mats and beads. And so clearly at the end of his life, his people took care of him, you know, which I find to be like so incredibly touching, that like there was this humanity there, you know, that got preserved over, you know, so hundreds and hundreds of years. So yeah, so I feel like going into the history complicates it. And then, but I also frankly think, you know, we have to complicate it in terms of questioning why we link healthcare and the state of health to citizenship status. We have to, because we don't live in that world anymore where you can close the gates. And we actually haven't lived in that world for a very, very long time, but we really don't live in it now. And when one part of the global community is struggling and is under attack by whether it's a COVID pandemic or something else like Chagas disease or even Lyme disease, right? You know, the rest of us suffer as well. You know, I really believe in that. Like, you know, we have to rise. All boats need to rise together.
Yeah.
Right?
Well, and also, I think we need to investigate the narratives, the narratives that are usually dominant, that usually take precedent about diseases and their origins. I think about AIDS, you know, the association of it with Africa, when in reality, if you look back, you can see that actually it was found in other parts of the world, that, you know, as early as the 1900s in Scandinavia, you had people who were exhibiting symptoms that were similar. So I think it's important also that we find those alternative narratives, right? That shed light on those gaps, so that we're not saying, well, this is how this thing started, right? It started in this segment and this population, but we look and we do our research and we realize, like, actually, you know, it's a little deeper than that. It's a little more complicated than that. Your book, and this is one more question, and we'll probably take audience questions. Your book is more than just an investigative exploration of an insect and a life-threatening disease. It's a deep dive into some very personal family issues about sexuality, loyalty, identity. I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about the process that you undertook. How did you balance the research with the personal, because I was so fascinated by that. It's not just this deep dive into this exploration of this insect and the history of it and the scientific definitions of things. You also take these moments where we see these very personal moments, familial moments. I've known you for a long time, and there were things about you in reading this book that I discovered. So I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about how you balanced that.
I read a lot of other books. I read your book, Cruising, and was taking inspiration from how to link the memoir to the research, because I actually was not expecting to have very much memoir in this book, actually. I really focused on the journalism. I really focused on the research. And I honestly thought that maybe there would be one paragraph about me and my auntie at the beginning of the book. So I have to give complete credit to my editor at Tin House, Macy Cochran, who suggested really making the memoir the spine of the book, right? And really expanding that. And, you know, I struggled with it because, yes, my auntie and I had, this was part of our connection, was this disease, but we had such a complicated mother-daughter kind of relationship. You know, I adored her, and I think she loved me as well, but she never accepted me as being bisexual or being queer, and she really struggled with that. She didn't talk to me for 7 years. She died without accepting me as being a queer person, and it was a point of pain. I actually wrote about it in my first memoir, A Cup of Water Under My Bed. And I was realizing this morning as I was thinking about this, that I probably could only write this book because I had already written that memoir. And when I was working on A Cup of Water Under My Bed, I was working through some stuff. I was working through a lot of family history. And, you know, I wrote that memoir with a big box of tissues right next to me the whole way. I cried my way through many, recalling many memories and reconstructing memories on the page. And so I was realizing, yeah, I think doing that work, having written that book, was really essential to now revisit my relationship with her from a different angle, because I think I was able to take another step back to look at her in a different way, to look at her as this kind of in some ways, a very classic, she has somewhat of a classic immigrant story, in the sense that, like, she comes here, she's undocumented, she goes on to get citizenship and become a school teacher in the public school system in New Jersey, and ends up falling in love and has a wonderful marriage. So there's sort of, like, you know, you could tell her story in a very kind of a classic American dream sort of way, you know, except for this illness and some other tragedies in her life, and her, you know, her homophobia that she struggled with so much. So for me, writing, you know, it was writing in fragments for sure. I was writing like little paragraphs. If anybody was ever going to go into my digital files, they would find a lot of little paragraphs and rewriting of many little, you know, not little paragraphs, but more like vignettes. And it was I mean, really the memoir part in a lot of ways is almost the last piece of writing that I did, of bringing those vignettes together, of my wonderful editor saying, here's the end of a chapter. Because to me, it felt like it was really hard to contain our relationship, because how do you grieve someone who hated such an essential part of you, you know? How do you grieve someone who never accepted you? And how do you grieve someone and explain that you really love this person? And we were actually on speaking terms when she died. We had been speaking for about a year or two, and we had shared painful moments, including being in the emergency room when she got really sick. And we had also shared really wonderful moments of watching movies together and going shopping. And so just, how do you get that complexity? So that's where a very good editor comes in. You know, the writer takes it to a certain point, and then if you're very lucky, you have a wonderful editor who steps in and gives it shape and form. So I'm very grateful to my editor for that.
Yeah, and that's a fantastic story, because I do think that one of the things that makes this book so wonderful and such a must read is the honesty with which that, you know, you depict your tia, and you know, not shying away from some of those difficult moments where, you know, you acknowledge the fact that she was not in agreement with your lifestyle, and yet you as a writer took this moment and wrote an entire book about her, and even in the chapters that aren't about Theodora, right? When, you look at Maida, or you look at, the whole thing with Pharma Bro, right? Like those, Theodora is in all of those, right? So this is very much a book about her, because she ended up launching this entire investigation that you took. So I think that's something that should be cherished and recognized, that a writer has the ability, writers such as yourself, has the ability and the power to be able to be honest enough to show all of the complexities of an individual, not just the ones that we sort of want to cherry pick, right? And say, well, I remember this, like I want to romanticize this person, and Theodora was a complicated person, and I think that's what makes readers so compelled to know more about her, right? When I finished this book, I felt like she was still out there somewhere, right? That she hadn't passed away, that actually, and that's a testament to your writing, is that these people take on she took on this sort of mythic status in my mind. So I think that's a really wonderful thing to be able to
Thank you so much.
Yeah, absolutely. And I have more questions, but
I think it's time for some audience questions.
Where are you? We don't see you.
I like that you're the voice of the goddess.
I know. You're like, there are 3 questions. Let's see. I will go ahead and ask you. Let's see. This question is from Scott. Diseases like Chagas and malaria are endemic, but typically affect poor people more than the wealthy. What are your thoughts about how this relates to the stigmas attached to them?
Yeah, thank you for asking that. That is actually very true, that there is a certain level of stigma attached for certain families because of poverty. And I found it really interesting. It came up in an interview with someone that I write about in the book, Janet, who grew up in a part of South America where this disease is pretty common. Her father had it, her sister had it. She herself ended up also being infected. But when we talked about the insects, she immediately wanted to let me know that those insects were not in her house. They might have been at her neighbor's house next door, but somehow not in her own home. And I really, my heart went out to her, because I really understood this idea of that, yes, that it has to, that we've, there's so many beautiful aspects of science and of germ theory, but on the flip side, it has also been used to conflate people with dirtiness and with filth and with unwantedness. And so, depending on people's experience in their communities, there's very much a sense of, there can be for some families a sense of, well, that's not us, it's the neighbors, or it's the other people on the street. But it is, in Latin America, this is really a disease that's also, it's a rural disease, right? You're going to be in rural areas where that's where you're going to have the most exposure to these kissing bugs. And when I went back to Colombia and went to a more rural area, I didn't feel the same level of stigma around poverty, in part because I was going into a community where everyone was poor, everyone was struggling, everyone was living basically as subsistence farmers there. And so, by virtue of kind of everyone being in the same boat, there was almost less stigma, if that makes sense. But nationally and in terms of news coverage, I think there's definitely some concerns there and some hesitancy.
Yeah, it's usually this idea. Oh, go ahead.
Go ahead.
No, I was gonna say, it's usually this idea that bugs equal dirty, right? This idea that well, if you have bugs in your house, then clearly you're not a clean person, right? Where I live in a clean house, I like to think, and yet I have ants in my house, right? I have an ant problem. So sometimes I think it is this idea that we associate bugs and insects with dirtiness and poverty, when that's actually, that couldn't be further from the truth. You have populations of individuals, living in environments that, people probably shouldn't be in, not because they want to be there, but because it's the only place that they can afford, right? That their government hasn't done a very good job of taking good care of them. So it's, it's a little more complicated than that.
Yeah, and it's interesting because this question makes me think too of how we think about Lyme disease in this country, and that I don't feel like we have quite the same associations of filth with ticks, because we think of that as people going out into wooded areas and then being in contact with the ticks, as opposed to the ticks being related to your home. So I think it's also something about home and home ownership and our ideas about, yes, cleanliness in the home. And this question actually makes me think of that particular patient, Janet, and something that we haven't talked about, which is congenital Chagas, which is the fact that this parasite is similar to the Zika virus, at least in the sense that it can be passed from mother to child during pregnancy. And in the United States, we have every year anywhere between 60 and a little bit over 300 babies that are born with this disease. But we don't screen for congenital Chagas. We don't screen these babies. And so many of them, if they're born and they have symptoms, they're oftentimes vague symptoms, like a low birth weight, jaundice, symptoms that could easily be attributed to other causes. So one of the incredible changes that I hope will be coming in the near future is prenatal screening for congenital Chagas. It actually, different state, there's federal guidelines that inform what state guidelines are. And there's actually, on that list, there are diseases that occur less frequently than congenital Chagas disease that babies are screened for. Wow. So it's not just that, oh, this is kind of very rare. It's just that this is so neglected. And actually that issue made me look at, like, well, how many babies are born to women in the US who came from South America and Central America and Mexico? And it's 700,000 babies every year. That's a lot of babies,
Wow.
So it would be, and the reason that Janet makes me think of that is because Janet did not know that she had this parasite, but her baby was born prematurely, was born already with damage to the right ventricle of his heart. And so he caught the attention of physicians. And luckily for her, her family back in South America said, there was one particular family member who knew about congenital Chagas and told her, it could be that. And luckily, connections were made and he was diagnosed. And the reason it's so important to catch these babies is because children respond really well to the two medications that are available for Chagas disease. That's not true for adults once they're out of that acute stage. Once you're in that chronic stage, it's not curable. But for children, even past that acute stage, those medications can be really effective. So it's so essential to find them before they progress onto illness. Yeah.
Another question from the audience. What do you hope your readers take away from your book, especially during this time when the world is still grappling with the COVID pandemic?
I have big ambitions for my readers. So I really hope that readers take away a sense of thinking differently about healthcare access in this country, in particular in the United States. And I say that because so many the patients here in the US with Chagas disease cannot easily get to see a primary care doctor, let alone an infectious disease specialist. Many of them, this is sort of like looking at the profile of who these patients are. Many of them work in low-wage jobs where they don't have health insurance. They might have coverage through the Affordable Care Act, but then it's not easy to take time off work or to lose that income in order to have multiple doctor's appointments. There can be some pretty intense side effects from the medication if you get to that point, which also means losing time from work. For people who are undocumented, it depends so much on where they live, what kind of access to medical care they have. So there are just so many barriers there that are really astonishing. And there's quite a number of people who I believe end up dying from this disease who didn't need to die from this disease simply because of lack to healthcare access. So a lot, my hope is that, people will walk away from this thinking about, a universal right, a human right to healthcare. And then the other kind of issue that I bring up in the book is that we've had a public health policy not of eradicating diseases, but of containing them. And so one of the things that I talk about in the book is that if you look at HIV and AIDS, we oftentimes think of it as being eradicated, but in the US, we've largely have contained that to the Black community, specifically Black communities in the South, where it's an epidemic, actually. It hasn't been eradicated. And when we look at something like tuberculosis, we eradicated it here in the United States, but we did not eradicate it around the world. And so you're disproportionately finding it among immigrant families here in the US. And you're also finding it among those who have spent time in homeless shelters and in the prison system. So really, we end up containing these diseases to really vulnerable, marginalized parts of our community. And so in terms of COVID, we have to think about that. Are we pursuing a policy of eradication or just containment?
Right.
I think that's a really important question for us.
Yeah, because you're starting to see these pockets, right? Where it's happening. One last question.
Yeah, go right ahead.
We have time for the very last one. This is from Madeline. What part of the writing process do you find the most difficult and why? I probably would need an entire 5, 6, 20 hours to be able to respond to that.
I was going to say, that's from one of my students. Hi. For this book, the part that I really found the most difficult was bringing together the journalism and the memoirs. So I wrote an essay for Lit Hub around books that helped me to navigate that. But it was really difficult until I realized that I needed to let the memoir be the voice that guided readers through the entire process, whether I was talking about my auntie and our complicated relationship, or whether I was talking about like parasitic DNA and mummies, or whether, the last part of the book is all about different patients around the country that I spent time with. And I realized, yes, I need to let my voice show up. And actually, Alex, this goes back to something that you said, which is that I also realized that I needed to let my auntie be a part of those chapters as well. And that was because, honestly, she was coming up in my writing as it unfolded. So I was spending time with Janet and her baby and realizing, oh gosh, my auntie had wanted to be a mother and to have pregnancies herself, and she wasn't able to. And like just remembering how painful that was for her, and also how surprising it was for me as a child, because I thought of myself as her daughter. So I was like, why would she want any other children? It's me, So it really allowed me to bring in parts of our relationship, even as I was talking to other people. I think that was an essential part, but it was really difficult. I'm saying this to her because she's my student. So, and I say this to my students, it is not, as a writer, you do not sign up for an easy job necessarily. So, but it's also worth the struggle, because it's so satisfying to finally, when it all clicks into place, which it does, it's an incredible feeling. Yeah, as you know, Alex, right?
Yeah, and I think one of the things that, again, I have to say, this book, I think, has such an amazing scope and breadth, and your ability to navigate between the sort of the scientific and the personal. It's a really important document. It's a really important documentation of the lives of individuals like your tia who have been affected by a disease and a parasite. Our communities need to know about this, right? Our communities need to hear this story, and I think it's wonderful that it's out there. So it's been such a pleasure talking with you. I just want to say also, Tin House Books, indie presses are fantastic for the work that they do. So I commend Tin House and this book. It's a beautiful book. It's really a powerful story. Everybody needs to read it. And also, support your indie bookstores like Vroman's. They're the ones out there selling these books, and we love them for it. Pandemic or not, they're out there and they're getting readers for us. So I love Vroman's, and I'm glad that they're hosting this, and this is a fantastic book. I just want everybody to read it now.
Thank you so much. Oh my goodness. I feel like I learned so much. It was such a fascinating conversation. Thank you, Daisy and Alex. And thank you to those who tuned in and sent us questions. Again, we do have signed book plates available if you order from us tonight. Just click on the green purchase button. It will take you to our website. Just make sure to write signed book plate in the order comments when you're checking out your cart. So we have that reserved for you. And also to those who tuned in late, don't worry, a replay of this talk will be available once the broadcast ends. And I think that about covers it. Thank you everyone once again and have a good night.
Great. Thank you so much, everyone. Bye. Good night.
Bye.
Bye.